Okay, so what we're talking about next, now that you've completed your grisaille underpainting, is we're going to talk about the process of glazing. And so for this first application of glaze, which should be step number 3 in the handout that you received, what you're going to do is you're going to use equal parts Galkyd, linseed, and Gamsol. In the instructions that you get, it refers to using Vermeer varnish and gum turpentine. We're working with a very low toxicity based oil paint, but these are kind of the close proximity substitutes, and they're equally effective, just slightly different and a little bit more user friendly. So what you're going to do is mix equal parts Galkyd, which will kind of create almost like a varnish layer, and it expedites the dry time. You're also going to use a little bit of linseed oil, and what the linseed oil does is it kind of restores that oil-based quality back to your pigments and kind of keeps that nice body that it has. It's also going to slow down your dry time, so if you are only using this, it's going to take a very long time for your mediums to, or your paint to dry. So that's what I have in this jar right here, is about equal parts Gamsol, linseed, and Galkyd. And what I have out on my palette right now, I have an ochre, a yellow ochre, and then I have a cadmium red, and then I also have a little bit of white. And we're going to apply the white in after we've made that initial glaze layer. So in order to start this, you're going to take a little bit of your ochre and just a teeny bit of red. A little bit's going to go a long way. Now in your painting kits, you might have a cadmium red light, so you might find that it's not going to have that same intensity that mine has. So you can see already mine's starting to pick up a fairly pink quality, and I'm going to want to knock that down, right? We don't want her to look like she's been out in the sun too long. And so what we're almost trying to do is think of it almost like a watercolor. We're really reducing the level of pigmentation. And so what we're going to have is a very soft, lightly tinted paint. And now what I'm going in with is one of my softer brushes, but it's up to you which one you choose to apply with. I recommend using your red sable brush. I'm using my black sable, very similar, but just a nice soft bristled brush. It'll give you a little bit more control and offers great fluidity for the medium. And so if you look, I've got a fairly lightly tinted base. And what I would recommend all of you do is, if you don't have a clear background, definitely clean off your palette, because it's going to be challenging to get a sense of the color. So clean your palette, and then if possible, put like a fairly neutral background underneath it. I've just got a sheet of newsprint, and that just makes it a little bit easier for you to gauge the color proximity. So now that I've got this light tint, let's migrate over to the painting. All right. So what you're looking at now, we've got 2 different stages of the same painting. And if you look at the one on the right-hand side, you'll notice that she's looking a little bit orange, maybe a little bit peaked. The reason for that is we've only applied one initial layer of glaze. So it's going to look a little bit heavy and orange initially, and as we work, we're going to start to knock that back. So what we are going to do is we're going to take our sable brush, and we're going to start kind of gradually glazing over your painting. And what's kind of nice about this is you're able to loosen up a little bit. You can kind of relinquish a little bit of control. The one thing you want to be mindful of is if the paint underneath starts to lift, then that means that you've got to stop what you're doing and give this a little bit more time to dry. The problem with the glaze is if the paint isn't set up adequately, rather than having these translucent layers of paint where the light can pass through, suddenly it's going to start to feel a little bit muddy and flat. So this is definitely something where if it's not dry, put it on the shelf, give it another day, and work on something else in the interim. And one thing to be mindful of is it's okay, when we think about glazing, we tend to leave the whites of the eyes. In this instance, it's good to start to work some pigment in. And again, right now I'm just putting down a base, and eventually we're going to work over the entirety of the face. So right now we're just kind of gradually starting to build that foundation. All right. So the next thing that we're going to start doing, and keep in mind, if it starts to run, if it starts to drip, if it feels too heavy, what's really nice about this is it's a very forgiving medium. if your base is dry, if it starts to get away from you, just take a rag and start to lift out. If it feels like maybe it's a little bit more orange than you anticipated, if it's too wet, you know, whatever the case may be, feel free to wipe it out with a rag. You can always start over with this process. So now what we're gonna do is, if you look at the instructions, they talk about working a little bit of white in, and what that's gonna do is start to bring back the highlights, because she's definitely become a little bit more neutral with her new bronzer foundation. So, again, brush choice is up to you. We're gonna do this process called scumbling, where we're taking a very dry brush and a dry paint and working it into a wet paint. So, I've got a little bit of white, and we're gonna start to work back in the highlights on the cheeks. So if we look at this example, right, we can see very clearly where the highlights are, and we wanna keep those. What's nice about the shadows is in that underpainting, those are really gonna come through and give us that structure. So we're gonna take a dry brush, and just start to gently work back in those highlights. If it seems like maybe you need a little bit more pigmentation down, you know, work a little bit more of that ochre and cadmium into your paint. Right, you can always build a little bit more into there. So it is a push and pull. The instructions do note, you know, well, you have this really strong foundation that you've created, you still are painting to a degree. You might not have to labor quite as much, but you still have to be mindful of how you're applying the paint. So working a little white. Definitely want to bring back that bridge in the nose. Now, if you're too light with this, that's okay. There's, you know, the idea is to have multiple layers. And so even though the packet that you have only goes through about like 8 or 9 different steps, you might find that you need to use 10, 12. I mean, it's really going to be dictated by the amount of pigmentation that you use, the amount of medium that you use. And so there's not one right answer, but don't assume that it's immediately going to be done. It's going to take multiple layers to really get it to where it needs to be. And so again, right now, just trying to work back in those highlights and dry brushing them to make sure that she still has a lot of dimension. Be mindful, this is a very important highlight right in here, and we don't want to lose that. That helps kind of give a little bit of definition between the cheek and the chin. The other area that you can start to work in, and this one you don't need to use as much ochre, is you can start to push back into the lips. For that, it's up to you which brush you use. I would recommend using one of your smaller sable brushes. Again, using your medium, and then just a little bit of cadmium red, maybe a little ochre, just to soften the intensity of it. And you might say, oh, that's still a little faint. I'm going to take my dry brush and pull a little bit more red and kind of dry brush that right into the medium. Now, one thing to be mindful of, and you can see my painting is probably starting to pick up some of this, is if your workspace is really dusty, when you're using thin glaze layers, it will pick up some of the dust. So you may have to kind of make sure that you're using a really clean rag. I've got some paper towel in here. Oops. But just be mindful of that. Like, don't do this next to your dryer or something like that. And so the ultimate goal is this will be done. You know, this layer will be done. Once I've kind of given it the subsequent highlights that it needs, I'm going to work back into the eyes. Kind of take my dry brush, push that in, right. We definitely want to make sure we keep that highlight. And so you can see what's nice about this is that white's immediately pushing out those highlights again. We're starting to get some of that structure back, but it's also softening that underpainting. So we're losing some of the intensity of the brushwork, and it's starting to kind of fuse together and smooth out. And so this will be done once you've kind of worked in all those whites, pushed in those highlights. Again, taking a dry brush just to scumble that white in. And we don't really need to worry about the headdress at this point. That will come later. It requires a little bit less intensity, right? Because it's not the focal point and we're not trying to catch that precise flesh tone. So, once you've kind of brushed that in, and you might notice while you're working on this, I would suggest that you don't, immediately walk away. What will start to happen, because this medium, this glaze is so wet, is it might start to kind of settle and pool. And so, make sure that before you, leave your dorm or leave your apartment, you've spent a little time with it, maybe work on something else for a little bit, just to make sure that your paint isn't starting to drip or run. You can see I'm starting to already smooth out certain areas just to keep it from kind of pooling up. We don't want it to look like, she put on a face of makeup and went out in the rain. Also being mindful that you're using a series of different brush strokes, right? Multiple directional strokes will help establish form. If you only work one direction, all of a sudden she's going to start to feel really flat, which we don't want. And once you've got this, you're set, and she can dry for a little bit, probably 24 hours. It depends on your workspace, depends on how much medium, but usually about 24 hours before she's ready for the next layer. And that's a wrap.